Welcome everyone, StealthyShiroean here, and today I'm bringing you my review of the Humble Choice Bundle for October 2022. It's the month of scares and spookiness, so I'm pleased to see Humble including a couple of horror games in this month's bundle. We also have a big AAA game as a headliner, which of course is nice to see as well. Let me know what you think of this month's bundle in the comments below, be sure to check the timestamps for specific games, and stay tuned for my final thoughts in the end. Okay, let's get to the review. Starting up this month's bundle is Golf Gang, a mini golf game with a bit of a twist. It's also a racing game against time and friends. I didn't actually bother with the multiplayer mode, but I imagine this could be a really fun game with a buddy or two. On its own, I wasn't a big fan of the time mechanic. Playing a similar mini golf game, being Golf It, I feel that just trying to hit the par or better is hard enough for me. Stack on a timer and, well, I did about as well as I expected to do. Luckily though, the game has a more classic mode where time isn't much of an issue. Shooting for the par becomes the primary focus, with a ticking timer that is largely ignored. Because of the fast speed golfing, the gameplay is a tad different than one might expect. There are various environmental objects that can be interacted with to further the ball's momentum, such as balloons. In addition, the player can hit the ball again, even if it's still in motion, which allows for a bit more freedom in directing the ball for maximum distance, or evading precarious ledges. Each of the levels seem well designed, and I think it's an overall good mini golf game. However, unless you're already a fan of this style of game, then I think it would only be something played with friends for any real length of time. Next we have Railroad Corporation, which is more or less the type of game that it sounds like, a railroad tycoon game. It's set during the 19th century, from the origins of the first steam locomotives and through their golden years. You take the role of an entrepreneur expanding your railroad business by laying down track, buying train engines, and sending them to load and unload various goods. Along the way, players have to manage their income to maintain these moving metal beasts, from general repairs to research into more efficient engines or new trains altogether. According to the Steam page, there are also other mechanics such as managing employees, political lobbying, and owning land for businesses, which all sounds pretty cool and hopefully adds to this management game. I had fun with what I played, but I felt the sound design could have been better. There didn't seem to be much to make the trains feel authentic, but that might be because I wasn't far enough to get to the bigger engines. Also, it's a missed opportunity that Railroad Corporation doesn't let you view the trains up close as they travel to and from their destinations. Not a bad game though, and I could see myself coming back to it. Epic Chef takes us into the wonderful world of gastronomy as a budding chef who just moved into a mysterious mansion within some zany town. I actually was really surprised with this game because it was not what I expected at all. The way I usually play these monthly games is to jump into each one without looking at any footage or reading anything about it so that my opinion of it isn't already set going in. So upon seeing the cover art on Humble and reading the name, I assumed it to be a frantic multiplayer cooking game similar to something like Overcooked. Instead, what we have is a Stardew Valley-like game where the players have to farm and prepare ingredients for their cooking ventures. And cooking really is the focal point of this game. The cooking minigame seems to be fairly complex enough to encourage experimentation and proper timing in order to create the best dishes possible. These cooking skills are then used in various competitions because the town of Ambrosia is all about proving oneself in cooking duels. This game obviously has a humorous story and setting, which I actually liked. First impressions with this one were good enough that I'd like to return to it. I especially liked its emphasis on cooking rather than a copy and paste of other farming sim games. Maid of Sker was the one game from the bundle that I had been most excited for. It's a horror game, as one would expect for the month of October, that is based on Welsh folklore. That alone made me interested in Maid of Sker, but the visuals and sound design is also top-notch. The best horror games for me are the ones that create a very immersive sense of place, which I think this game does very well. Exploring the well-crafted hotel was creepy, even with the minimal scares that I came across. Enemies in Maid of Sker are attracted to noise, so every little creak in the walls or a door closing felt like an alarm going off. It doesn't pay to panic, as it will more than likely attract even more attention. The music here is hauntingly beautiful, with various Welsh hymns played throughout the game. It adds to the atmosphere and also grounds the game in its Welsh roots. With roughly a 5-hour playtime, this definitely seems like the game I'll be playing for this spooky season. Disciples has been a series I remember wanting to try back in the day, but never ended up getting around to for one reason or another. But now, Humble has graced us with Disciples Liberation, which is a turn-based strategy RPG. The closest thing I have for comparison as to how it's played would be King's Bounty, which I never cared for that much. But in this game, I enjoyed the style of combat presented here. Combat takes place on a hex grid, and you start with the placement of your units, which can be a combination of your companions and troops that you train at your home base. Depending on your choice of friends with one of the 4 factions, can determine what kind of troops you use in battle. Of course, each of these units have their own abilities that could be used directly in battle as frontline troops, or have passive abilities if they hang back as backline troops. Outside of combat, the game plays like a third-person isometric RPG where you explore areas, collect loot, and come across story beats. The story presented here was serviceable, but way too early for me to tell if it's really any good. I appreciated the voice dialogue, even if it was only passable. Although, I felt it was jarring when dialogue scenes didn't have voiceover. I liked the visuals as well, with the flashy particle effects and well-done unit designs. Disciples Liberation seems like a solid game that fans of this style of turn-based strategy will enjoy. Now that I live in the US again, I finally have access to the next game in the Dark Pictures anthology, being Little Hope. People in Asia got something different, but more on that in a little bit. First, what do we have here? Well, similar to Man of Medan, it is an interactive horror game that plays out very much like a movie. 5 characters are thrown into disarray when their bus trip has an accident. With nowhere to go, the characters find themselves going towards the town of Little Hope to look for help. And since this is a horror game, obviously there's going to be a bunch of creepy things happening to them along the way. With the bit that I played, it seems to have something to do with witchcraft, but beyond that I can't really say. The cool thing about these games is the ability to play them multiplayer, although I was disappointed to find the friend pass that was given to me with the Humble Choice purchase ultimately wasn't usable as far as I could tell. So I couldn't do the shared story option, but instead I opted to play the movie night option with my wife, and had shifted control from player to player. It was fun, and I think it adds a little something extra to the playthrough, but obviously isn't necessary. From what I played, I thought the production value was really high here. The controls are a bit wonky at times, but it didn't bother me that much. Interactive movies never really were my cup of tea, but I'm sure I'd have fun with this one whenever I return to it. However, for all the people in Asia, they didn't receive Little Hope, but instead got Silver Chains. I may not live in Japan anymore, but I felt like I still wanted to shed light on these regional changes when I'm aware of them, just since I had to suffer with it for so long. At a glance, I'm happy to say that Silver Chains is at least within the same ballpark as Little Hope, compared to the Man of Medan's replacement being War Sim. Silver Chains is a first-person horror game where you play as Peter trying to find out the mysteries of an abandoned house. There seems to be some puzzle-like obstacles to overcome, as well as cat-and-mouse hiding sequences. Visually, the game looks pretty decent, but the trailers seem to suggest a lot of jump scares. Personally, I'm not a fan of that kind of horror because I feel that it's usually cheap when overdone. Without actually playing the game though, I can't say for sure if it'd be something worthwhile. If anyone has tried it, then let me know in the comments what you thought of it. Dealing with the depths of hell and monsters, although not a horror game, we have Monster Train. This is a fun card game that follows a similar style to Slay the Spire. Players control a monstrous army and must guide their train through the pits of hell while fighting Heaven's Holiest along the way. At every step of the path, there are various upgrades for the player's deck, as one would expect from a game like this. Each run is random, so the strategy is supposed to vary from run to run. Combat plays a little differently in Monster Train in that there are multiple levels where the fighting takes place. Enemies usually spawn in at the bottom layer of the train and work their way up to try and destroy your pyre. This made for an interesting dilemma of where to spend cards since you could have multiple levels with enemies. It felt like there was a good bit of varying strategy between the decks in the 2 runs I played. Also, I felt the presentation was excellent in this one as well. The music was top-notch and felt appropriately epic. I really appreciated how the monsters would change based on the amount of upgrades they had too. Another enjoyable game in this month's bundle, and I would like to come back to this one at some point. And our big AAA headliner this month is Deathloop, a shooter designed from the creators of the popular Dishonored games and Prey reboot. Players take the role of Colt, who has himself stuck in a Groundhog Day situation. Every time he dies, or if a complete day transpires, then he is reset back to the beginning of his so-called loop. The concept of this sounded pretty cool, but I did have some misgivings about it because of the possible repetition. Luckily, Deathloop has some things in place to combat this. First, whenever you die, any knowledge you've gained for your objectives stays with the player so that you can continue where you left off. In fact, if you died in an area, then you could load back up at the start of the area and the appropriate time of day without needing to replay the beginning over and over again. Also, the game gives you a retry system early on in the form of something called a reprise slab, which essentially allows you to have 2 deaths before the loop resets. Outside of this fun gimmick, the gameplay here I think is what you'd expect from a shooter. It's fairly fast-paced if you're running and gunning, but it can be slow and methodical if you decide to go for a stealthier approach. I felt the story was interesting, and I wanted to find out more about what was going on with this time anomaly-affected island. However, I thought the banter between Colt and his rival Juliana was what really made the story fun for me. While I have a list of Arcane Studios games in my backlog, I definitely want to play this one again in the near future. Okay, let's wrap this up and see if this bundle is worth it or not. I based my rating solely on whether I thought the game was worth playing on about an hour or so of hands-on gameplay. Overall, this was yet another good month. I'm sure Deathloop is probably something that many have been hoping to see in a choice bundle for a while. And now, many of us have the second episode of Dark Pictures Anthology, so can't really go wrong there. Much of the rest of the lineup is very strong, making this a fun batch of games. Also, as mentioned earlier, I'm glad that Humble has finally given the Asian region a comparable replacement in price point and genre this time around. I hope when a replacement is necessary again, they make a similar choice. Moving on to the recommendations, we have our must-plays of the month, which are Maid of Sker, Deathloop, and Monster Train. Maid of Sker really sets a nice tone and atmosphere, and I really like that in good horror. The Welsh source material adds to it and hopefully will tell a story a little different from standard horror tales. Deathloop was a fun Arcane Studios shooter. I like the idea of the Groundhog Day mechanic, and I want to see what clever ways it might be used within Deathloop's narrative. Finally, Monster Train is a fun card game with a unique combat mechanic. For my strong recommendations, I have Disciples Liberation and Little Hope. Disciples Liberation was a fun turn-based tactical strategy RPG that supposedly has choices that actually affect outcomes in relationships, which I greatly enjoy in the RPG genre. And Little Hope, as another episode in the Dark Pictures Anthology, carries on with its interactive movie brand of horror in a game that thrives on its storytelling, even if the gameplay is a bit lacking. My week recommendations this month are Epic Chef, Railroad Corporation, and Golf Gang. Epic Chef turned out to be a humorous farming sim game with a fun focus on cooking as its core element. Railroad Corporation is a nice railroad management game that I could see fans of trains or this style of game to sink some time into. And finally, Golf Gang had a unique concept to mini-golf with its racing element that sets it apart from others, but would probably be a game best played with friends. Following up last in the Don't Bother With section is another month with nothing in this section, which makes me happy. That wraps up my thoughts on this month's bundle. This was a great month for me with plenty of good games added to my library and even a couple scary ones for the Halloween season. Do you agree with my thoughts? What games, if any, are you looking forward to playing? Let me know what your thoughts are or if there are any different recommendations you'd make in the comments below. I hope this video helped you in some small way, and if it did, then please consider leaving a like, comment, subscribe, or whatever it is you feel like doing. Thanks for watching, and have a nice day.